of Detroit music poetry. So, hey, good morning, everybody. We are live. This is the American Mixtape class with Mr. Smith, spring 2022 semester. It's actually a great week. It's 2/23/22. It's a mouthful. And as you all know, our guest this morning is my dear, dear friend and a colleague and collaborator of many decades. I met him. I remember the night I met you, Peter, in May of 1986 at Alvin's. And class, I had to fake my ID because Alvin's was 21 and over, and I was 18, right. And I had a fake ID, and I got in to see a band called the Layabouts, which we love to dance to. So welcome to class. And he's Peter never graduated college, and he had a wildly successful career in local media up in Michigan. So I want to thank your classmate for carrying us today with these unbelievable questions. And we're going to get right into it, Peter. And then, like he said, as we were warming up, you guys can drop extra questions in the chat. And I'll probably stop the recording probably in about 35 minutes. And then we'll have a bit more of a freestyle. But we're going to record this for posterity and for history's sake. So, Peter, the first question this wonderful student has asked you is how you migrated from radio and newspaper work, which is a very kind of in-the-moment kind of journalism, to writing a novel. Is this something you always wanted to do, or how did you decide to transition out of the articles? And you're still writing articles for Fifth Estate, but from writing short articles and doing radio, how did you transition into writing a novel? What was your process getting there from journalism to a novel?
If you look at the back of the book, there's an endorsement by our friend Kara Hoffman, who is an award-winning author, has lots of books published by Simon & Schuster. And she read the text, the manuscript, and she said, "Peter, this reads like a Fifth Estate article," the Fifth Estate being the magazine with which I've worked for so many decades. So, and it does. Sure, there's a novelization of the events that actually occurred. Some of them are made up out of whole cloth, but in many ways, it wasn't much of a transition. And in there are histories, and if you read other novels, I mean, I probably shouldn't confess since I'm not being tortured, but that the rich character development that you find in lots of novels that I admire, like Kara Hoffman's, it's not there in mine. So it is much more written in a journalistic style. So it wasn't much of a transition.
When I was in college, a professor of mine that Peter is friends with, called George Tisch, always used to say to me that my essays for college were too journalistic, because I was actually trained as a journalist in high school, and then I wrote for the college paper, and then I was writing for a free weekly paper called the Metro Times at that time, and then I would go to hand in my stories to Tom Jurek at the Metro Times, and he'd say, "Smith, these are way too academic."
Well, yeah, a lot of people ask, and this is a question that always stumped me. They say, "Why did you write it?" Or what was? I think that was partly in your question. You know, it was started now about 2.5 years ago. I almost don't have memory of it. I've heard other authors say this. I never really believed it, but in a lot of ways, it wrote itself. I just sat down and started stringing together things that represented what I call a memoir of a generation. People say, "Well, is this an autobiography thinly disguised as fiction?" And somewhat, but really not. It really is, as I said, the memoir of a generation. And I think when you start to get older, like I am, you start looking back on your life and you think, what did I do? Was it worthwhile? How did I perform when at crisis situations? What were the ethical challenges of that day, and how did I respond to them? And in that era of the 1960s, with riots and wars and assassinations, we were called upon to make a lot of ethical decisions. And I think in many ways, that's what the book is all about.
Well, one of the questions is how did you put your mind back in 1967? I mean, you're a very young 81, but students on the call may have grandparents your
younger.
age or have younger. Grandparents younger. Yeah, I have a friend who's a grandparent who's got grandkids the age of the students on the call. So so and they know that my child is almost 30. I've talked about that a little bit. So how you say once you sat down to write it, it was easy to do, but what did you pull out a lot of old pictures? Like, what did you do? The question is, what did you do to put your mind back in the summer of
Well,
67?
you know, in the, say, 1950s and 1960s, when I was in my teens and in my early 20s, my dad would tell me stories about the 1930s. And I'm thinking, how can he remember 30 years ago? And he told it, you know, with stories with great gusto. So the memories don't disappear. I mean, some people said, why didn't you write a memoir or an autobiography? And I said, I just don't have the enough notes and memory and what have you. A lot of people keep journals through their lives, particularly political and cultural activists and people involved in the arts. And no, it was just in my brain. And then and, you know, you think one thing and that leads to another. And plus, I did do a lot of online research, particularly for the portions that I wanted to be historically accurate. So you know, anyone could do it in terms of memory.
Well, it's funny
You
because
didn't.
one of the things they say about people like, well, I feel the way this way, and I'm a generation younger than you. You're, you know, very much of the greatest generation at the edge of baby boomer, and I'm in the smack in the middle of Gen X. But you know, they say, you know, we remember in great detail what happened 30 years ago, but we can't remember what we did 30 minutes ago. You know, so
Yeah.
or we walk into the kitchen and we're like, what did I walk into the kitchen for? But Memoir has about 20 years ago, around the late 90s, early zeros, Memoir came under great scrutiny because there was all these like Oprah, you know, National Book Club memoirs that turned up to be total farces. And I'm very close to a memoirist that I follow called Mary Carr, and she's written greatly about this. And she says if you're writing memoir, you do have to tell it exactly as it happened. You can't fudge on the details. So that's one reason why you went to novel, was that allowed you to fudge up some of the details.
Well,
I even challenged you on a couple of them.
well, I didn't.
After I read the first draft, I remember.
It is not a memoir and it is not an autobiography. And I mean, I give an example. There was, and I'm assuming most of the people read it. At one point, Paul and Michelle, someone said, if you didn't want it to be seen as an autobiography, since your name is Peter and your wife's name is Marilyn, do you think maybe you shouldn't have called it Paul and Michelle? Okay. But I don't think the people that don't know it doesn't matter. Anyway, Paul takes a dose of LSD and drives to this rock and roll venue called the Grandee Ballroom in Detroit. And then a whole series of things happen. And on the way back, Michelle has to drive the motorcycle. And a neighbor who read the manuscript said, wow, I didn't know Marilyn could ride a motorcycle. And I said, she can't. She didn't. She never did. And they kind of looked surprised. And I said, it's fiction. And what I wanted, again, well, one, to make an exciting, little episode. I could have had them drive in their car. You know, they got in the car, drove to the Grandee, it's a little more exciting to go on a LSD driven motorcycle ride and everything, that transpires then and on the way back than it is just having a, ride in a car. But people did take LSD and ride on motorcycles, including me, but at a different time. So how much of it is accurate? In some ways, the only thing I would say is 100% authentic. And this matters to readers like yours who don't know me, is the historical points about the war, about the riots, about racism, about police brutality, about the legitimacy of the use of violence. Those are done with excruciating accuracy and adherence to what actually occurred, whether or not the person who they think is Michelle hit a right winger in the face with a stick or not. Does that really matter? Did that really happen? Actually, it really happened, but it wasn't Paul's wife or in real life who did it.
I think that's one of the things, and I am, and you and I have talked about this over our 35 years of knowing each other, but I come from a pacifist-ish tradition, and I definitely, when I was growing up in the 80s, I idealized this time period so much in my head, and there's that image I showed them on Monday of the protester in DC, and it was, I don't know if it was 67 or 69, but it's that famous iconic picture of the protester sticking the flowers in the guns. And everybody in your crew in the novel is all armed. Everybody's got a gun, and I think that's one of the things that's kind of shocking in the book, but I think it also gives people a realistic picture of Detroit in the late 60s. A lot of people were packing, and my wife and I don't own firearms, but we talk about this a lot. We have friends around, every other house on this street probably has enough to start a small civil war, over here in West Cookeville. There's a lot of, people who do carry for personal protection, a firearm. It's very normalized in where I live to carry a firearm for personal protection. I'm sure lots of the students on the call probably took firearm training, growing up. Their dads took them hunting when they were little. They killed their first, animal when they were 10 or 11. The next question that's really is so, and it's so powerful, and the whole book could be about this, but you chose to tell it about the summer, and you give this much more vast overview of the counterculture and of the movement this way. But the student who wrote these beautiful questions wanted to know, did you all participate? Can you describe what it was like for the Fifth Estate covering the uprising or the rebellion or the riot of 67? And I know you did try to tell the story as it happened in the Black community and exactly what happened that night. But did you recall what was it like covering the riots? That's what the question is. What was it like to be in? What was it? Terrifying, exciting? Just being in something, and I guess some of us remember the summer of 2020, but and it depends on where the students live. If they lived in Nashville or Knoxville, there were huge protests in the summer of 2020 in Nashville, Knoxville. Cookeville, we had a very, very small protest. They were worried that they were going to burn down Cookeville. There was no violence in Cookeville.
Yeah.
What was it like being a journalist and an activist during those, however many days? Remind us how many exact days it was. Just a handful of days in the summer of 67.
Well, I think mostly it was exciting, and I look back on whether that's an appropriate emotion or not. It was like, and I use that phrase in the book, I think in another context, but it was the chickens coming home to roost of a racist society and of a people. I do say that in there. You can't do people like has been done to African American people and not expect some reaction. I mean, if they're kept out of, particularly out of the political. We're talking now 50 years ago, kept out of the political system. Well, there's other ways to react. I mean, riots have a long history in the world. There was something, the Gordon riots in England in 1760. They finally had to bring in British troops that killed 300 Londoners who were trying to burn down the Bank of London and attacking rich people. So, there's, when people are angry and they're concentrated, they react riotously for grievances. But as white people who feel pretty safe in the world, and particularly more so then than even now, it was just great excitement. There was fires everywhere. We felt safe, even with people, with National Guardsmen pointing guns at us. Certainly, I would think that 98% of white people, if they would have gone out on that street corner of Grand River Avenue and West Grand Boulevard and seen hundreds of Black people looting stores, there's no way in the world that they would have gotten out of their car and mingled with them. But having always gone to inner city schools and mostly to predominantly Black schools, I felt, I had a real reading of what the potential was for harm to me, and I was absolutely correct. Everybody was just, and as I don't know if that came across, but people didn't give high fives, and they gave this, you'd go, hey man, like you'd give this, giving five was like that, like sliding hands, and people giving, hey brother, how you doing, that kind of thing. So it was a grand adventure for all of us, but and for a lot of the people looting, it was a transgression that went way beyond just trying to be a consumerist by innovative methods. It was, again, it was payback. But at the end, it was the black community that suffered and that has never fully recovered from it. So the excitement and sense of adventure, looking back on it, I think was a little misplaced on our part.
Yeah, Peter, we were leaving class on Monday after I gave them a whole overview, and they haven't given me a lot of feedback on some of the juiciness of not of your profanity or of the drugs and the sex, but of the politics of it. They're all playing it pretty safe right now, and I told them, a controversy is something on which good people can disagree. But we had, just a couple of days ago, the Putnam County Democratic Party had their windows smashed out by vandalism. But vandalism on the other side, there was a billboard on Willow Avenue that had President DJT number 45 flanked by Reagan and Lincoln. And when they put up that banner of it got vandalized, and then there's multiple trucker convoys apparently now heading to DC right now to stir some stuff up. And then of course there's there in Portland there was a BLM march just the other day in Portland where people were died, in a political
a guy shot him who said he wanted to kill commies and Antifa.
Well, I guess he did. I mean,
yeah.
That's, yeah, so anyway, so I said to them as we were leaving class the other day, it's like, I wish this was more historically nostalgic to them and less real to what's going on in our world today.
Well, let me say, this is, everybody in the 1960s didn't look like this. Everybody didn't have long hair and wear bell bottoms. And in fact, the people that were on the political far left, like the characters in Summer on Fire, I think are the exception. And the majority of people probably just went about their business, went to college. A lot more people went to rock and roll venues, and great numbers went to anti-war and civil rights demonstrations. But it's easy to characterize a whole generation. Like I asked my mother one time, whether she was a flapper during the 1920s. That's how far back and she looked at me like I was crazy, because that that was just an image. That was just a characterization of the era. At
the peak of before MLK became kind of there was several things that happened at the end of Martin Luther King Jr.'s career that made him less favorable. But at his peak, I Have a Dream peak, majority of Americans supported Reverend King. At the peak of the anti-war movement, the majority of Americans wanted a withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. So there was popular support, but you're saying is so true, is that it's always been the minority, a small minority that actually participated on the ground. And I think you probably have friends your own age that maybe have some kind of, hindsight sort of yearning for what you did, and knowing that they weren't there with you, knowing that they were living different lives. And so I think you probably have peers your own age who are reading this book today, being grateful that you were there. Even my parents have amazing stories, but my parents weren't quite at that level that you were at, and they're the same exact age as you. So go ahead. You were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of armaments, I mean, we had an office that had its windows broken out by right-wingers. We got death threats all the time. That's why there was weapons there. People had been, shot and assassinated close to us, people that we knew. But virtually nobody, except for that one character, what was his name? I can't remember his name, Jeff. He actually did carry a gun, but he was like unusual. None of us would have considered carrying weapons out and around our neighborhoods. And today I even think it's foolish. I'm not a pacifist, and I'm prepared for most situations, but a middle-class white person coming and going in this society has no need for carrying a deadly weapon with them. In my estimation.
This question is so incredible, and I think it's just I'm sure we've probably got at least a couple people on the call that love video games. I love cinema. I watch a lot of movies at home on the medium screen. Don't go to the big screen as much since COVID. But the question is, did you find yourself during that time or in writing this novel at any point desensitized to the violence that was going on, that you perceived as the violence, I guess, of the of the oppressor, so to speak, the violence of the
Right.
police. And how are you emotionally, how do you emotionally process? Because I mean, I'm rereading the book. So I read the book as your friend, when it came, right before it came out, and also, full disclosure, to write a glowing review of it, but I read it this week, thinking about the young adults in this who are on this Zoom with us. We've got almost 30 people, hearing us talk this morning. So I'm reading it this week, thinking of them, and I'm thinking, man, this must be deep and kind of hard for them to read all this stuff. And so, did you find at any point that you were, I don't know, did you feel like you were becoming numb to it, or did you feel like you were sensationalizing it? Like, what was your attitude towards that? I'm not talking about the part you just addressed about,
No, I know.
the fact that you and Michelle had
right.
a gun under the bed, but like the actual burning of your city and the police beating the crap out of your friends and stuff like that.
I suspect the opposite could be true. In fact, I would ask the people that are listening whether they're desensitized to violence, given that there's so much of it that's repeated every night on the news, that movies are ultra violent and what have you. No, we were always shocked at what happened there, and we were shocked during the riots as they were going on. And in fact, at one point when I read that section, the only section that I'm happy with the book. The only section, and maybe this is a little arrogant, that I'm actually proud of is the section about the Algiers Motel, which was so disturbing to me to write that when I finished it, I stopped. I thought, why am I doing this? This is so, because all of this stuff about, George Floyd and everyone else just makes me so angry and so depressed that we're still dealing with all this and that people do this to other people. I thought, why am I writing this? It wasn't even about people reading it. I thought people should read it because people should know what happened, but it was having an extraordinarily depressing effect on me. But I guess after I didn't write for about 3 weeks, but then I went back to it.
Peter, that's so interesting, because that's one of the next questions was, how do you, as a white middle class person, that you describe yourself, self-identify as a heterosexual white guy, middle class white guy in Oak Park, Michigan, how do you write about these struggles of the African American community? But you just kind of have addressed that, but maybe walk it back with me just a little bit. I'm going to say two things, and then please respond. And I'm kind of paraphrasing from these amazing questions, which I'm just kind of using as prompts this morning, and which I'm so grateful for the student that wrote them. But today, in today's media, even in today's so-called liberal media, I'm thinking off the top of my head, somebody like commentator Bill Maher, there seems to be this pejorative stereotype of so-called, woke white people, trying to sort of occupy the space. But one of the things that you've communicated to me, and maybe you've said it to me, or maybe I've just got it from reading your Facebook page, haven't you gotten like an enormous amount of support from the African American community in Detroit for this book and for telling this story? I mean, you've gotten this like overwhelming solidarity from them, and it's so freaking moving to me. I don't know.
A best-selling book, a best-selling book at most bookstores. 50, 100 books. In an African American bookstore, Source Booksellers in Detroit, it sold over 300 copies, and I think there is an appreciation of my writing about the pain and suffering that community had experienced for so long. But I still think there has to be, pardon me, Black voices that talk about that period. And if you think about, I used to have a whole list of books written by white people about the Detroit Rebellion, the Detroit Riots, Grand River and Joy, Middlesex, Them by Joyce Carol Oates, all of it. And all of us are these sort of white observers of the Black experience, and we talk about how it affects us emotionally. I mean, that's the value of historical fiction. You can insert the emotions as you interpret them into it. But I didn't dare and wouldn't presume to be able to express the emotions of black people at that moment. There's a book, if people, I'm assuming everybody's read it, the young man, the son of the owner of the illegal drinking establishment that throws the bottle at the cop car that begins the riot. He's called the man that started the Detroit riot, and he wrote an autobiography, a memoir of that called Hurt Baby Hurt, that's self-published. That's so amazing. You could just sweep every book about the Detroit riot written by white people out of the way and read this. And it was self-published, and now it's going to be, I found it, and it's going to be reprinted by the University of Michigan Press. So in that, we'll find out the emotions of the people most affected by it.
Is it, what's the name of the author? Apparently there's several books by the same name. Walter Scott? Did you?
Walter Scott, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
The book, if you're look on Amazon, they want $10,000 for it. I'm getting text messages. I'll turn off my.
What about the anti-war movement and the decision by some members of the anti-war movement to engage in violence? You used a term, "chickens coming home to roost," that was used by Malcolm X at the time of the Kennedy assassination, which brought considerable fire to Malcolm X, and there was this fever among a small contingent of what was formerly Students for the Democratic Society, that only violence would end the violence, and
right.
that there was a bit of a, I think, a delusional kind of, urgency among some of the anti-war activists, perhaps in not solely facilitated, but by taking the quantity of psychedelic drugs that were being consumed and the sense of urgency all at the same time, and you sort of addressed that in a kind of an interesting way towards the end of the book. Why did you decide to include the trip to Monhegan and the possible involvement in property damage that ended up not happening? The whole thing ended up, falling apart at the end. Spoiler alert: they don't do the action.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to? Because that was very suspenseful for me reading it. I was like, oh gosh, why does he have to go there? Like take me back to the Grandy Ballroom. Take me back to that parade down Woodward Avenue with all the different groups. Why does he have to go? But it's so pertinent and so misunderstood part of the movement. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why colleagues of yours at the time felt motivated in that direction, and why you chose to tell that story, and why you chose to tell that story the way that you did.
Well, some people have criticized the book as a novel, saying, whoa, wait a minute, why is that tacked on there? Because the book initially ended with the bombing of that Vietnamese village. But, and again, I hear this as sort of a cliche about the characters write the novel, which I always thought, yeah, sure. But the characters kind of woke me up at night and said, you're not done. You're writing more. You're off to Monhegan. Part of it is I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed talking about the island that's so dear to me. Both of my parents are buried on the island. And it was a further exploration, as I said, of the legitimacy of violence. It was an idea that this group that you mentioned that called themselves the Weathermen, that called bringing the war home. You remember, the idea that the would-be bomber said, he said that the thought is that these acts against Vietnam, this war that was based completely on lies, that wound up killing about 3 million Vietnamese and 50,000 of our soldiers, that they can be here in the homeland without any result, or that the empire can wage war as it did without any domestic results other than peaceful demonstrations. And I don't think what's the answer? I don't know. One of the people in the book says, what if it was SS officers? Remember, initially they were going to blow up this dance of Coast Guardsmen and Michelle and Paul are horrified. And then someone said, "Well, what if it was SS officers in Europe during World War II? Would you say that that they should be safe from harm?" And Michelle says, "They're not SS officers. They're coasties. They're like my brother-in-law, who was in the Coast Guard and patrolled the Mississippi River, not the Mekong Delta." So I don't know. I mean, that's what I mean. It's an ethical question that people have to confront. And I made the would-be bomber not out to be a very admirable character. So I'm tilt towards that not being a legitimate way to respond to state violence. But the question is always still open.
All of these things, class, all of these things happened.
Let me get
I'm
some.
guessing most people are not going to watch 50 documentaries or movies that I recommend. But there was a documentary from the early zeros around the time of the Iraq War that covered this movement called the Weather Underground. And one of the tragedies very early in their movement is that they didn't know how to wage war against war, and they killed one of their own. They had accidentally killed one of their own people
Yeah.
in trying to manufacture a bomb. And these are people that maybe weren't Peter's close friends, but they were all part of the same
No, I
subculture.
knew Diana Oughton, one of the
Right. So
people that,
it's incredible. So Peter, I got on that. I'm probably deviating too far now, but just reminded me, I got on that call last night that you put the link to. And I mean, I honestly, I can't really even go into this at all, but Naomi Jaffe was on that call last night. And I thought that just kind of took me back, she was a part of that organization, and she's still, an actor. She's your age-ish. So you went to grab something. What do you?
I got actually the current issue of the Fifth Estate, and I wanted to, that I went to. I can't begin to tell you how many George Floyd marches in Detroit. They were predominantly black, in the suburbs that were almost exclusively white. But here, in the massive demonstrations, as I'm reading from this, following the murder of George Floyd, at least 28 people died in a wave of social unrest. In the 10-week period, there were 574 riots, 624 arsons, 2,300 incidents of looting, 97 police vehicles set on fire, 12,000 people arrested for protests, 13 police were shot, 9 hit by cars, 2,000 reported injured, mostly from rocks and bricks, $2 billion in property damage. 200 cities imposed curfews. 96 National Guard troops came out in 34 states. So what can we say? I mean, if Diana Oughton, the woman that died in the bombing, if she would have told me she was up to that, I would have tied her to a chair, to not let her do that. But what can we do? I mean,
and we don't know the names of these. We know George Floyd's name, but we don't know the name of all those, those police officers or all the activists that died 2 summers ago. And I guess that's the thing that's kind of freaking me out a little bit. So in 2003, exactly this month, 19 years ago, the largest anti-war demonstration in the history of planet Earth occurred.
Right.
And on February 15th, 2003, to try to stop the war in Iraq, and it didn't work. And in June of 2020, that was bigger than what happened in Detroit in 1967. I mean, June of 2020 was way bigger than anything that happened in the 60s. And we have, guess what? People are still angry.
Right.
There's laws coming down in our state class that would probably make. I mean, I'm not trying to be hyperbole or outlandish here. But Peter and I talked about that. Peter's like, "Are you sure?" Peter put no pressure on me to teach this book, right? I really wanted to. I wanted to teach this book actually because of the songs and how well it fits my theme for this class. That's what we should bring this thing home.
Let's go to that. Yeah.
But let me just say, class, that the Tennessee legislature is afraid of you all being allowed to talk about these things, because I'm sure there's people here that are gonna, if they are honest, are gonna write me. They're like, Mr. Smith, that Werbe is crazy, and I hated his book. And I hope at least one of you, will, if you felt that way, will tell me that, but you're not, your values aren't damaged because you were exposed to ideas that were different than your own. And that's the value of what we're doing here this morning. And that's why I feel confident that it's okay to talk about it. You don't have to agree with it. Let's talk about music, Peter. I can't believe
one thing
I'm
wait a minute.
are in this book. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm actually interested in people that dislike the book for whatever reason, because I got lots of compliments. It's a regional bestseller around Detroit and Michigan, but I'm very curious to people who would be my grandchildren's age and didn't live this directly, and it's a different region. And if you disliked it or had criticisms or hated it, even, I'm more interested in that than someone saying they loved it. I get a lot of that. Okay, yeah, the music, 80 songs. Andrew counted up were mentioned or groups, and he put together a Spotify file of it that's available on my website, peterwerbe.com. And are we supposed to drop out of Spotify? I forgot.
Let's not go there. Let's not go there either. But Peter, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drop the play. I'm gonna find the playlist right now. I'm gonna drop the link to the playlist. You're gonna talk for just about 2 or 3 more minutes about music, and then I'm going to shut down the recording, and we're going to beg them to drop questions in the chat in real time, just so you can get a little bit of that feedback that you're seeking. And
if we want, hopefully we would get. I would like if people feel comfortable face to face doing it.
Well, I'll beg them, but let me just tell you the culture, and I don't care if this is on the video. The culture of real-time online learning is that a lot of professors make their students turn their cameras on, and it becomes a form of coercion. And so I'm the guy that does, I'm not making anybody turn their camera on. And the culture is, I'm sure if they saw 2 of their friends turn their camera on, they'd all turn their cameras on. But since none of them have their cameras on, no one wants to be the first person to dance at the club. That no one wants to be the first person on the dance floor. They'll be the second person on the dance floor. So we'll ask them for you and for your sake when the recording is over to turn their cameras on and talk. But they might just use the chat, and that's
but don't feel
okay. That's completely
it's okay. Don't feel obligated.
Tell us about this amazing soundtrack, and I'm going to grab the playlist for them and drop it in the chat.
All right. Well, one of it didn't occur to me to do anything that most authors do, like make an outline. So it was just totally organic. And so people went to the Grandee Ballroom. People were listening to rock and roll radio. People, I'm trying to think where else there was music. But I didn't set out to think, I'm going to list 80 performers, but rather it just happened in the story. So with his concise mind, Andrew counted them. Actually, and I was stunned that there were 80, so he put together this Spotify list, and I said, well, let's put them all in. He said, do you really want to have Frank and Nancy Sinatra singing Something Stupid? And I said, yeah, I think so. Let me listen to it. I listened to it, and I thought, no. And it's a lot of the people from the 60s and the 70s are a little disappointed with some of the music, because there's some of these, they expected all like a classic rock and roll list, but instead got jazz as well. And if you read the book, you remember there's people, jazz greats like Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane mentioned, so they're in there as well. So I think a lot of people would have liked just a straight ahead, classic rock station type of playlist, but we put in there what was mentioned, even Beethoven. Although what's in there? Moonlight Sonata, rather than Beethoven's Ninth, which is about an hour and 10 minutes or something. But thank you, Andrew, for putting it together. As always, you're absolutely amazing.
Well, Peter, he's giving me too much credit, but I gave him the idea of the playlist. But once we started building it, it was a full collaboration. He and I, we spent a lot of time organizing it, putting the songs in the right order, and all that kind of stuff. And he's got 64 songs, 4 hours and 23 minutes. And for their final for this class, they have to make a playlist, and I'm asking them to limit it to 15 to 20 songs. That's mainly because I want to be able to actually, understand what they're doing. And if they all gave me a 4-hour playlist, I would have nothing else to do but pay attention to their playlists. All right, Peter, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
This will be made available to the world on YouTube, but we're going to beg them to throw some questions in the chat as we wind up today's meeting. And they only come for 50 minutes, 3 days a week. And it's my favorite class that I'm doing right now. And